Hello, good morning. Welcome to episode number 220 of Learn with Lorna. This episode is pre-recorded because I am flat out with all sorts of events and activities this week. This week we are looking at the subject of Caithness correspondence. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland. We have one in Inverness, one in Fort William, one in Portree and one in Wick. And it's the office in Wick that we are looking at particularly today. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we are very, very grateful for that. And if you're able from within the UK to gift aid as that donation as well, then we really appreciate that as well. So welcome to this week's episode where we are going to Caithness and looking at the subject of letters and correspondence within the collections held at Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives. If you follow the Nucleus Facebook page, you will know that they've been sharing all kinds of great content from letters this month, and they will continue to do so. If you're not a follower already of the Nucleus page, do head over and have a wee look at some of the things they've been sharing there. You'll also know that if you are a long-term viewer of Learn with Lorna, that I absolutely love a letter. I love getting letters, I enjoy writing letters, and I love letters in our collections. Not quite as much as I love diaries, but it's a very close thing. Letters are, of course, something that is immediately familiar to everybody, and letters are written for multiple reasons. We write them for official and legal purposes. We have letters that we write in the course of our work or business. Sometimes letters exist because they're giving a written trail of evidence, or someone is making a stand, and that document, that letter, is evidence to that. So, for instance, writing a letter to a newspaper or writing a letter to an MP. But often the letters in our collections are there because they're sending love, they're sending news, they're sending tidings of family and friends. Sometimes they're written to pen pals, and this was great. Anne and Nucleus and I had a wee reminisce about this. We hold examples in the Caithness collections of schools writing to pen pals in different countries in different parts of Scotland and the UK. If you had a pen pal, let me know. I had one. It was great. So letters serve loads of different purposes, and that's what makes them endlessly fascinating, I think. They are not personal in the same way as diaries because they're always meant to be read at least by one other person, but they do often convey a personal perspective, and they can bring a very individual focus to a national or an international subject, as well as shedding a huge amount of light on social history, whether letters written in the 1800s or the 2000s. The letter may well include references to, global events and activities, politics, fashion, what's on at the cinema, what's on at the theatre, references to travel, whatever it might be that's just a passing comment within that letter is shedding light on society at the time that letter was written. And of course, they're also often very visually appealing, particularly historic letters with seals or stamps or those folds. I love unfolding a letter because that's something you can't see in what I'm talking about. Is that very often these letters are folded into very small rectangles, and you have to unfold all of the letter in order to be able to read it. So letters are fascinating for lots of different reasons. So let's have a look at some examples from our Caithness collections, and thanks as always to my colleagues in Caithness for their suggestions about some of the things to include in this episode. So I'm going to start with the letter book of the Medical Officer of Health from 1908 to 1914. Now, I've spoken before a little bit about letter books. They can be quite tricky to read. They're on very, very thin paper. They're often volumes where letters have been written and then blotted. So we will have that kind of very thin tracing paper, almost like layer of the record of the letter, copy of it. So it can be quite difficult to read them because they're quite often jam-packed full of multiple layers. This particular letter book covers the letters of the Medical Officer of Health for the County of Caithness. Now, in the early 1900s, it had become clear that the existing fever hospital in Wick was no longer fit for purpose. and in 1906 the health authorities in the borough of Wick in the county of Caithness agreed to erect a joint hospital for the treatment of infectious diseases. And the Medical Officer of Health letterbook contains correspondence on a range of subjects relating to the health and sanitation of the county of Caithness, including insanitary housing, cases of infectious diseases, various things, but also to the new fever hospital that would be built and which would open in 1910. There are letters that detail items from the old hospital which could potentially be reused. So, for instance, they discuss reusing 6 bedside tables for the new diphtheria ward. And there are letters that talk about the urgent need for this hospital and the need for this hospital to open as quickly as possible. But I'll read out some words that my colleague Jen at Nucleus wrote to take up the story. Once the construction was underway and the building was nearing completion, all that was needed was to set a date for opening, and this was hoped to be set sooner rather than later, as there had been several outbreaks of scarlet fever in the county. And on the 30th of April 1910 and the 2nd of May, letters were sent to this effect, including to James Young, the county clerk, asking him to propose to the local government board the opening of the scarlet fever pavilion ahead of the opening of the rest of the hospital, with the addition of just 1 or 2 emergency nurses who wouldn't mind sleeping in the duty room because their accommodation wasn't ready. They say that this accommodation to open this scarlet fever ward was urgently required due to the outbreak of scarlet fever in the borough of Wick. In the end, however, despite these urgent pleas, the full hospital wasn't opened until the 13th of September 1910. And by looking at this correspondence alongside other records, we can learn why that was. Although the building had been finished by April 1910 and was intended to be opened much sooner, it was delayed due to the death of the king. The outbreak of scarlet fever in the town meant that one of the wards was used before the hospital was officially opened, so that plea was heard. It was officially opened by Lord Pentland, President of the Local Government Board, on the 13th of September 1910. The new fever hospital, when it opened, contained an administrative block, offices and typhoid, diphtheria, scarlet fever and observation wards, with 22 beds in total, but with the ability to extend that number when necessary. Jen concludes that, incidentally, for those of you familiar with Wick, the Town and County Hospital now offers assessments for patients with cognitive or memory problems and palliative care. But it's a great example of a letter or a series of letters that were written for work purposes, which contain information of both local and national significance. So the opening of that local hospital, the pressing urgency of the scarlet fever outbreak in Wick, but also when you look at that in conjunction with other records, you find that the reason for the delay was a national event, the death of the king. And so sometimes letters can just really give us a reflection on both the local and the national or international. And some of the letters, I think, that best illustrate that crashing together of a personal life and a global event are probably the letters written during World War I and World War II. You may remember that we met Jack Davidson in a previous Learn with Lorna episode. Here's a reminder of his story, thanks to Val. Jack Davidson was born on the 30th of October 1909 at Old Hall, Wotton, to George and Netta Davidson. When he came of age, he bought Lower Doonray Farm and enlisted with the Ray Company of the 5th Battalion Seaforth Highlanders. His university degree qualified him for a commission, so he attended Sandhurst Military Academy and returned a lieutenant. He married Isabel Stewart, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. George Stewart, Millbank House, Thurso, in December 1937. In 1938, Jack and Isabel's daughter Elizabeth was born, and the following year World War II broke out, and Jack was called to serve as Major of D Company, 5th Seaforth Highlanders in the 51st Highland Division. Jack wrote an account of his experiences in North Africa, and we hold a copy of that here at Nucleus. We also have some letters that he wrote home to his Uncle Jack. And here's one of those letters that's referenced there. And it's, again, a great example of a letter that is written to convey news and love and fondness to a family member, to reassure that he's safe, but also hanging over that all the time is the fact that this letter wouldn't have to be written if this global event wasn't happening that had taken him so far from his family. 16th of July, 1942, at sea. My dear Uncle Jack, dinner time has come to an end and I have a few minutes to spare before I go on my rounds for the night. I thought I would like to write a line or two to let you know I'm well and enjoying life. Just what I can say is very limited, for although we censor our own letters, we have to observe all the rules of security. The reasons, of course, are obvious. Our departure from England was of course expected, and we slipped away quietly some time ago. Since then we have sailed on placidly without seeing a submarine, aeroplane or mine. Now I reckon we are out of dangerous waters, so we do not anticipate trouble in that direction. The weather has been particularly kind to us, and anyone who has been sick has had no good reason to be so except overeating. Actually, for the last few days we've had a goodish pitch all the time, but it came on so gradually that none of us noticed it much. To date we have had one port of call for water and fruit, but no one was allowed ashore. We expect to tie up again in a day or two, however, when there is a prospect of a day or two ashore. We are all looking forward to it after being afloat for so long. I rather think the countryside would appear quite familiar. It was very hot for a time, absolutely sweltering, but it has cooled off considerably now, and if one stands on the deck bridge with eyes shut, one can quite easily imagine that one is standing on the rocks at Dounreay, with a goodish breeze coming in off the sea. You don't have to stand long when thoughts of an overcoat are forcibly brought to your mind. I actually didn't think it was so cold in this part of the world, but then I'm told it is winter time. Our biggest bugbear is the blackout, of course, especially when it was hot. The ship got like an airless furnace at night. It's better now, but the advantage of it is offset rather by the fact that we have to draw our blinds soon after 5:30 in the afternoon. The ship is a fairly old one, but we're all comfortable, even if things are a bit crowded. Food is excellent, both men and officer, and quantity seems to be unlimited. Fresh fruit, sugar, and 101 things one never sees at home abound, so there is no hardship in that line. The chocolate supply seems unlimited, and the troops saw to that in the first few days. I reckon that was the cause of the seasickness. Life on board passes quickly from day to day. We have a hefty training programme to carry out daily, lectures and so on. Together with concerts, we have quite a few talented lads with us. We sing songs, sports and so on, and it leaves little time for leisure. Any time I seem to have spare is spent in sleeping. Well, I'm not going to write any more, as this has to be handed in for posting tonight, and I still have to finish Isabel's letter. Please give my regards to all at Bucky's. I think of you all often, and I do wonder when we'll be together again. In the meantime, the answer is patience. If you can manage, do write me a note. And I found that an interesting letter to read because it seems very upbeat, and many of the war letters that I've read do seem very upbeat. That's partly because you don't want to worry people. It's partly because at the moment of writing, things are fine. You've got camaraderie, you've got enough food there. Interesting there, the references to food and what he could get that he couldn't get at home. But the war keeps impinging in that, the references to submarines and aeroplanes and the blackout. But generally, it sounds quite upbeat. But Jack would be killed in action a year later at the age of 33. And he's buried in Sicily. And I know that Jen Wilson, a regular viewer of Lorna, I know that you raised a glass to him when on holiday in Sicily and attempted to go and see his grave as well. And that really moved me when I saw that message on Facebook that you had gone there to pay tribute to him on the back of a Lorna episode. And when something like that happens, when a person dies, their letters are immediately elevated to something else, something even more precious. The everyday words and content are something to be pored over again and again, or else something to be treasured and put aside and tenderly cared for and protected. And I think that's something we see a lot with wartime letters, that the news they bring is so valued and so precious, and particularly when life is lost after that item is treasured. And it was similar, I'm sure, for the many Highlanders who have left these shores, either willingly or not, over the centuries, particularly if they emigrated at a time when returning home again ever was very unlikely. Letters to and forth, I am quite sure, were treasured as they carried not only proof of life, of someone that you weren't going to see again, reassurance of health, but also news, either news of a new country that people had gone to, or news of the one that had been left behind. And these are some of my favourite letters. Nucleus Collection P953 are the records of Highland News and Media Limited. And this was Anne's choice to include. When Highland News and Media closed a publishing premises in Wick, they deposited a number of fascinating items with the archive, including a volume of letters. And the volume of letters are entitled Letters from Home, and they comprise letters written to John and Christina Sutherland, who had left Caithness to start a new life in Canada. The letters are from friends and family in Latheron and in wider Caithness, and they date from 1847 to 1908. And as you might expect, they shed light on a huge amount of material and evidence of a huge amount of things about life in Caithness at the time. There are references to poverty throughout the letters. So, for instance, there's one example where someone talks about the fact that they need to replace a cow, and it's going to cost £14, and that's the equivalent of around £2,000 today. And just the complete impossibility of that ask. There are references to cattle plague and the fact that every person contributed £1 to those who lost their animals. So they contain evidence of hardship and struggle, but also evidence of good times and the closeness of communities. And proof of what I have said so many times over the 5 years of Learn with Lorna that have gone, that archives are full of stories which resonate with us very deeply and which can move us to tears, despite the centuries that have intervened between the moment it was written and the moment we read it. This extract here from that volume of letters moved me to tears when I read it. Smerrill, the 10th of February 1847. My dear children, I would not have written you so soon until we would have received one from yourselves in return of our last, but I have to acquaint you of a sorrowful news, which may show you that we have no city of abode nor time to put before us. We have to tell, dear children, that your father has departed this life Friday last, about 10 o'clock forenoon, after a short illness of 1 day. But he was 3 days confined to bed, and at the same time poorly all winter. He was interred in the churchyard at Latheron on Monday last, in as decent a manner as we could, there being upwards of 80 people conveying his remains to the place of interment. We hope he does not miss us, but we miss him, and will do so as long as I live on this earth. All our friends and relations paid their last due respect to his remains, but, dear children, I see the house empty, and myself bare since he was carried away, and very lonely. Although my friends and family are all about me, their breath would be but cold to me instead of his. Dear children, your brothers and sisters are in health, but as for myself, I am very poorly, and I was poorly even when I had no reason, but now I have a great reason which time will not make up. But I wish the Lord would make me ready to follow him where we would part no more, but enjoy one another forever. Death is making rapid progress in this place, sudden breaches in many families. William Gunn in the Ballantyne's son is no more. Robert and the rest of the family is in a low state and not likely to recover. Your dear father was called quickly away. He only gave 2 gasps when the soul departed his mortal frame to be carried by angels to the seat of the blessed. We hope and have all reason to believe it to be so. There was none put their hand on the dust but myself, not that they would do it, but I would not allow them. I was strengthened to it. A portion of scripture rose to my mind, which was, wait upon the Lord, and he will strengthen you. This kept up my spirit as long as he was about the house. Dear children, for now we have none. This same is sufficient, but hope you will write us as soon as you get this. Your affectionate mother until death, Widow Sutherland. I've spoken before about letters and diary extracts that deal with religion and death, and how that strength of faith is very, very visible in these letters. But I found that really moving, that reference of, even were all my friends and family about me, they would be cold because they're not him. John and Christina Sutherland, who that letter was written to in Canada, had left Caithness in, I think, the 1840s, when many were being cleared from their land, or from land in the Highlands. And the mother who wrote that letter to them refers to the reality of this, of the clearances and the impact of that, in this letter from March 1847. She says, "I would have wrote to you before this time, but was waiting to see what things would turn to. There was talk abroad that all Smerall was to be removed, us along with the rest. Therefore I delayed writing until I would see the result. Now the summons are out, and there are 4 houses to be removed. Henderson and Alexander Campbell, David Gunn and Donnelly Widow and her sons, with many others also. You likewise wish to know what stock we had, which is the horse and 2 cows, 1 calf, and working implements. They're in good order. Your father promised the smith 3 farlets of meal for the cartwheels, which I gave, and as it is to be all hirers that we will have to employ, it will leave us somewhat tight. But indeed, dear son, I would not like to be troublesome to you in disquieting your mind about our difficulties or troubles, as none can avoid their fate or whatever is allotted for them here." I don't know if she means here on this land or here on this earth, but none of us can avoid our fate or whatever is allotted for us. But that reference to the Highland clearances and the reality of that on the ground at the time, again a series of events so consequential to the story of the Highlands over centuries and still, but also on a personal level. She's talking about something that has caused her fear and concern, that she didn't write to her son until she knew what was happening because she wasn't sure if they were going to be forced out of their house, and that news was written down by her and relayed to her son in Canada. Of course, some people dared to stand up for their rights and for the land that they had been on or what they had been accustomed to having. And there are letters about this in the Caithness collection too. P400 includes the Clythe Crofters letter, written on the 15th of January 1835 by Donald Sutherland, John Forbes and James Clark of the Clythe estate. The letter was written to George Sinclair of Ulster, and it protests the treatment of the tenants on the Clythe estate by Sinclair's factor, Dr. Henderson. As my colleague Anne said to me when she was talking about this, the desperation of these men to actually write a letter of complaint is very moving, because they would likely know the likelihood was their letter would at best be ignored and at worst would get them kicked off the land. And it gives you something to think about, that writing this letter was a very brave act. The letter is long, written to the landowner detailing the grievances of their treatment by the factor. Multiple things are recorded in the letter. It opens with the words, "Worshipful Sir, having known your Christian character and benevolent disposition, I think it is my duty to lay before you the state of your tenants in this estate. I believe that there are no tenants in Scotland as used as they are." The writers say that they will lay out their grievances and note that they will say nothing that can't be confirmed by evidence. And here are some extracts of what they accuse Dr. Henderson of. "There was an agreement betwixt him and the fishermen, by which they were bound to give him all their fish as their fish curer, and he was bound by the same agreement to receive them. On the 9th or 10th of August, a great deal of fish was caught and taken to the shore, at which the poor people were very happy, especially as they never got the same price for their fish as people on other estates, and also to relieve their bills already given for their rents. But when they came to land, they were ordered to keep their boats in the sea from 3 in the morning till 9, without letting them know the reason for it. And after that, they were ordered to go wherever they pleased with their fish because he wouldn't take it. When he knew that the tide was out and they could not get into any harbour, until their fish were almost useless, so that the fishermen of Wick were coming into the shore with their second fishing before they got clear of theirs. And in the end they received for them only 3 or 4 shillings per cran, when the herring was 10 shillings per cran in other places." The letter includes a description of an incident when Dr. Henderson summoned all the tenants to his house. He says, 2 seconds, I have skipped ahead and I want to read something else to you before I do that. Here's another extract from the letter. When a tenant comes to the estate, Dr. Henderson makes them sign a paper, but never gives them a copy of the agreement, by which means he never stands to his engagement. If any person makes any improvement on his house or land, he immediately lays an addition of rent, which quite discourages every person from improving anything. If a young man is obliged to take a bowl of meal as he cannot get his own, for this he pays 6 shillings or 8 shillings more than he would in a public market, and everything else in proportion. He almost yearly sends out charges of removal, so clearance, and then the poor tenants either have to remove or agree to whatever addition of rent or other items he is pleased to impose, besides having either 6 or 9 shillings to pay for these changes. Add to this the threatenings of the laying on of violent hands, sometimes searching through poor fishermen's houses to see if they took home a few herring for the use of their family, or prohibiting to give a few herrings to the poor people at the shore. So you really get a sense of what they think of Dr. Henderson here. And this was the one I was going on too early to tell you. The letter also includes a description of an occasion where Dr. Henderson summoned all the tenants to his house. And this is what it says. Some years ago he named all the tenants to attend on a day at his house, took them all one by one, made them sign a paper without them knowing what it contained. Certain persons inquired what the cause was, why they had signed that paper. It's nothing to do you any harm. And in this way he got all to sign. Each person as he signed was conveyed to the garden without allowing them to return the same way as they'd come into the house, until there all had signed. And they were kept there until all had signed. Some persons who afterward found out the cause for this say that the reason they had been asked to do this was that there had been a complaint made against Dr. Henderson to the proprietor. The proprietor had questioned him about it. But what he's saying now is, I have all of your signatures and I will amend them to anything I choose to say now. It finishes, if the people at the time had thought that the paper contained anything of this nature, they would have undergone first the greatest hardship before they had signed it. And in one final bit from that letter, and a story of one man's particular act of bravery. So they write, a poor man who fell deep in arrears, he a few weeks ago sent for him, and said that if he would give him his daughter, who was in a few days to be married, to be his housekeeper, he wouldn't touch any of his subjects this year, but if not, he would take all he had. The man, knowing his character, that these 15 years past, not one housekeeper had left him without having her character ruined and with a bastard child to him, and fearing his intention, refused to give his daughter. And so he sent and took all from him, even to his very spoons. I don't know, obviously, the entire story. Archives will, letters like this will only ever tell you one side, but he certainly is not painted well in these documents. It's an extraordinary letter. It's very powerful, and one which was a huge risk to write, and they acknowledge that in the letter. They know they're taking a risk writing to the landlord about the factor. So sometimes letters really reveal the ordinary person's fight, people whose names might be lost to us completely otherwise. But letters can also shed light on those whose names are very familiar, and that's what I want to finish with. Caithness has connections to many famous people, and I want to finish by highlighting correspondence relating to 2 of them. P772 is a collection of research into the works of Robert Louis Stevenson. Robert Louis Stevenson is of course famous as the author of Treasure Island, The Mysterious Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and other works, but he also has a connection to Caithness. Of course he has a connection to Caithness. Robert Louis Stevenson was from a line of famous lighthouse designers and engineers, and he was particularly fascinated by his grandfather, Robert, and wrote a book about him entitled Records of a Family of Engineers. The Stevensons were responsible for a substantial number of lighthouses, including Caithness's Dunnet Head, and given how many times we have spoken about the danger of the Pentland Firth and the Caithness coastline, you can imagine how valued the Dunnet Head lighthouse is. Encouraged to take up the family trade, Robert Louis Stevenson started to study lighthouse engineering in 1867, making trips to Caithness, Sutherland and Orkney. Unfortunately, he was completely and utterly unimpressed with Caithness. He says in a letter You can never have dwelt in a country more unsightly than this part of Caithness. As for Wick itself, it is one of the meanest of man's towns, and situated certainly on the baldest of God's bays. Bit harsh. But it was perhaps that Caithness connection that led to the research of Donald Sutherland. And it's that research, 30 years worth of research into the works of Robert Louis Stevenson, which makes up P772, a collection in Nucleus. It's well known that Robert Louis Stevenson was a correspondent of J.M. Barrie, the author of Peter Pan. In 2020 there was a book published which examines this relationship, edited by Michael Shaw. The book is entitled A Friendship in Letters. But did you know that J.M. Barrie also had a connection to Caithness, and it's a letter that tells the story? I'll hand over to the team at Nucleus and just read out what they sent me to tell the story. Barrie's connection stems from his sister Margaret, Maggie, who courted Reverend James Winter, who was the minister of Bower Parish. For some 6 months prior to his tragic death, he fell off a horse while out riding. Margaret and James were said to have courted for 4.5 years. Sadly, his passing came 3 weeks before their scheduled wedding, and as J.M. Barrie was unable to attend the funeral, he sent a letter to the Bower congregation. The original of J.M. Barrie's letter is held in the University of St Andrews Special Collections. However, at Nucleus, we hold a copy of the Northern Ensign from 17th of May 1892, in which it is quoted along with words from his sister. And I think I'm right in saying that the sister, I think, was too distressed to attend her fiancé's funeral. And the editor writes, "I have received through her brother, Mr. J.M. Barrie, who could not leave her for the funeral, a loving message to the congregation of Bower, the reading of which will be the best conclusion to the pathetic life drama of your friend and mine. She says to the congregation that they are her loved ones, for they called him to Bower under God, and gave him the mission to which he was about to bring her. And as he loved them, she loves them. God, who gave his Son for the redemption of men, has told her that he had need of that disciple's life also, and that he died to bring the people of Bower nearer to God. So God chose his own way and took the young minister, dear to them and to her. And she says, God's will be done. And she thanks him, and she wishes that the congregation to thank him for taking away so suddenly only one who was ready to meet his God without a moment's warning. God's great goodness, she said, in not taking away one that was unprepared is her comfort and should be yours. She prays that the Reverend Winter's 6-month ministry among you and his death among you may long continue to bear good fruit. And always she will so pray and asks you to pray for her. And she says that you are not to grieve for her overmuch, for she is in God's keeping." And J.M. Barrie, in his letter, added, "This is a word from her brother who cannot leave to come to the funeral of his dearest friend, the purest soul I have known among men. This is a word about her. You have never seen her, but you knew him, and they are so alike in the depths of their religious feeling and in humility, and in so many other things, that if you knew about him and you loved him, and therefore you know her too, and may always think of them as one. They were 4.5 years of their love story, and it began the first hour they met. It never had a moment's break. There was always something pathetic about it, for they never parted and never wrote but solemnly and tenderly, as if it might be for the last time. It was so pure a love that God was ever part of it." Again, it's that connection between faith and death, and the recording of that in a letter. That sentence that I found really striking and powerful, that sentence there, I'm grateful to God that he called someone who could be called without a moment's warning, and you should be grateful about that as well. Interesting letters. So there you go. Letters can be personal and public. They can be romantic and dramatic, or legal and precise. It's always a pleasure to read the letters in our collection, and I really hope you've enjoyed hearing some of them as well. I was so interested as I was writing this that I'm definitely going to do a second episode on Caithness correspondence, and maybe I'll split it into some other counties and areas as well. I hope you can join me next week. Next week I will be looking at the story of forestry in our records, and a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland's a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're really grateful for that. And I'm also really grateful for all the comments that come in. I see them every week and it lifts my heart, so thank you for sending messages.